The history of reading and rereading the Quran has been especially marked by attempts at contextualizing the Arabic scripture. Whether through the life of the Prophet, the collected oral reports of the early Ummah, or, more recently, the ever-expanding notion of late antiquity, there has been and continues to be an effort amongst the Quran's readers and hearers to ground the text in space, place, and time, to set the Quran's anchor in history and culture. In the last 5 decades, this centuries-long project was volleyed a major critique in the more radical forms of historical, critical Quranic revisionism. Since the overwhelming majority of evidence regarding the early Islamic movement only appears centuries after Muhammad's death, the logic goes, nearly every detail of the Prophet's life, ministry, and community is up for grabs. Even rudimentary details of the Quranic prophet and his people, locales, names, religions, cultures, they all henceforth seem unmoored. Of particular note amongst these sorts of issues are the specific places in which the Quran appeared. While the Quranic text makes rare references to places such as Mecca and Yathrib, there's essentially nothing within the Quran to plot these locations meaningfully on a map. Scholars less tethered to traditional conceptions of early Islamic history have used these sorts of Quranic silences to relocate some or all of the Quranic corpus to environments far removed from the Hijaz, the Levant most especially. This doubt about the Quran's homeland is then thrown even further into question by the agricultural and economic observations of Patricia Crone. She notes in several places that repeated Quranic references to agriculture and commerce do not jibe well with the famously barren climate of Mecca. She mentions with quite a bit of evidence that the Quranic audience is, or is overwhelmingly, agriculturalist. They grow, amongst other things, grain, olives, pomegranates, and grapes, and none of these would thrive in the endless heat of Mecca, untouched as it is by extensive fresh water or rainfall. In all these observations, Crone also hands us a startling comment about the Quranic depiction of the sea and seafaring. She says, with parentheticals her own, references to sailing and to the sea are both numerous and vivid, suggesting that the Prophet has been to sea. The people addressed rode not only on cattle, but on ships. Some of these journeys could have been commercial in nature. What would the Prophet at sea, presumably as a merchant, tell us about the rise of Islam, the primary audiences of the Quran, and the cultural sphere in which Muhammad and his people regularly moved? One more note. This is a thought experiment. I do not and cannot claim that I've uncovered some otherwise unrecorded episodes from the life of the Prophet. Instead, this purely creative reading of the Quran is meant as a means of reconciling two viewpoints. On the one side, that the Hijaz and Mecca specifically was a remote location far from larger cultures of late antiquity, the Greek, Persian, Ethiopian, and Yemeni spheres. And on the other side, that the Quranic milieu was a cosmopolitan hub of culture and trade, meaning one of two things: either that Mecca was a much larger, more advanced settlement than is often thought, or the revisionist claim that the Hijaz is not the setting for the Quran at all. My only hard conclusion here is that these two claims are not in opposition. One more question about the life of Muhammad, his occupation. The very earliest sources on the matter claim what most traditional Islamic histories claim too, that Muhammad was a merchant. The Armenian history of Pseudo-Sebios, almost certainly written within decades of the Prophet's own death, remarks a man from amongst those same sons of Ishmael, whose name was Mahmet, a merchant, as if by God's command, appeared to them as a preacher. This is then followed up by fragmentary remains of Jacob of Edessa's history, written about 50 years later. Mahmet went down for trade to the land of Palestine, Arabia, and Syrian Phoenicia. In the following century, the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq likewise claims that the Prophet, as well as his wife Khadija, at least occasionally worked as merchants. As a child, we notice the famous story of Muhammad meeting the monk Bahira while on a trade caravan with Abu Talib. Later, while working for Khadija, the prophet-to-be again traveled to Syria with Khadija's slave boy Maysara. But otherwise, we have oddly little to say about Muhammad's livelihood as a merchant, and certainly nothing which claims that he's been to sea while doing such work. All we have of Muhammad as a merchant in the earliest sources, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, is a small number of trips, always to the north, and always on land. But what of Muhammad's actual day-to-day work? Assuming the validity of these independent reports that Muhammad was some kind of a merchant, clearly he went on more than just 3 or 4 trips in his whole lifetime. But on these other trips, we have nothing to say. Can we propose other work trips that Muhammad would have taken in his lifetime? There must have been others, but when and to where? The traditional biographical literatures on Muhammad are quite detailed about his movement in the Medinan period of his career. But the Meccan period, both before and after his prophetic mission began, is much less nuanced. We can suppose that the early Muslim historians were not specifically interested in this topic, as it doesn't really seem to factor into the Prophet's ministry, that is, into Islam. Perhaps the issue was simply irrelevant. Or perhaps there were negative associations with being a merchant that later Muslim historians wanted to distance Muhammad from. Or maybe there was some early Islamic apologetics at work, and a well-traveled Muhammad might make the Prophet seem less favorable? Perhaps all of these, or none of them. Whatever the case, like all human beings, Muhammad was shaped by what he did for a living, and the Quran, whether we read it as believers or as non-Muslim historians, reflects the life and character of this particular man. The following hypothetical sea voyage is a reconstruction based on a particular diachronic reading of the Quran alone. By reading the Quran through different chronologies, all of which are themselves hypothetical, themes and transformations across the ministry of the Prophet can seem to appear. The reading that takes us to a seafaring trip follows Theodore Noddake's often used Quranic chronology. In the first Meccan period, Noldake proposes a surah order of 55, 112, 109, 114, 113, 1, and 54. We start with Surah 55. Traditionally, this surah is named Ar-Rahman, the Merciful, after the surah's first word. This name, the Merciful, is not in standard use for all 7th century Arabic speakers. While Surah 55 simply opens by addressing God as the Merciful without comment, later surahs show that others don't use that name for God at all, and some of these don't even recognize that name. Ar-Rahman as a divine name gives us a slight tip towards the south, to Yemen. As has been often noted, Ar-Rahman, the Merciful, is a name strongly associated with Himyarite Christianity. Compare the old South Arabian Rahmanan. So our first clue. The audience of Surah 55 is immediately familiar with the name Ar-Rahman, while the audiences of other surahs are much less so. Next, Surah 55 is stylistically distinct from any other surah. It bears the Quran's most consistent refrain, "So which of the Lord's blessings will you both deny?" While a couple of other surahs have occasional refrains, including Surah 54 that we're going to discuss shortly, Surah 55's refrain appears across the entire surah. It's a full third of its verses. Second, the surah is uniquely addressed to 2 audiences throughout. If you don't know any Arabic, Arabic has a dual form between the singular and the plural, which this surah, and only this surah, uses from beginning to end, including in the refrain here. The surah is telling us then in no uncertain terms that it's addressing 2 audiences that are clearly distinct from each other. Now generally this is explained as addressing both the human race and the jinn, but this could be more easily explained if the surah was designed specifically to be recited in 2 different locales. Could one of these have been Yemen, where the name Ar-Rahman was much more familiar? Next, Surah 55 features a great number of details regarding commerce and sea travel. The sun and the moon move in ways human beings can predict. The world itself is discussed as a mizan, a great scale or balance, at which the two audiences are warned not to cheat. We then meet the produce of trade. On it, that is the earth, are fruit, date palms with sheaths, ingrained with its husk and fragrant herbs. God is then introduced as the Lord of the points of the compass, the Lord of the two easts and the two wests. God made the oceans and the produce that they make. He let loose the two seas to meet. Pearl and coral come forth from both of them. God controls ships and their movements. His are the sailing ships, raised up on the sea like mountains. And God has set limits on travel beyond the confines of the earth, which can only be crossed by divine will. The surah then concludes with a unique fourfold discussion of paradisal gardens, the most elaborate discussion of the gardens of paradise in the early Meccan period. A lush paradise even by Quranic standards, filled with rubies and cushions, pomegranates, and abundant greenery. So Surah 55 opens by addressing two audiences, naming God in a slightly more South Arabian register, discusses trade and sea travel, and arrives, as it were, with one of the most detailed descriptions of the gardens of the afterlife found in the entire Quranic corpus. So, does this surah's movement reflect a physical movement during the work life of the Quranic prophet? This rather odd surah is then followed in Noeticus chronology by 5 very short surahs, 112, 109, 114, 113, and 1, all of which could be easily committed to memory. That is, surahs that can be very simply taken on the road. Surah 112 is a remarkably brief response to two oral creeds, one of the Jews and one of the Christians. Then the next surah in the sequence, 109, pushes back against the enemies of the prophet, to you your religion, to me my religion. Surahs 114 and 113, the two famous surahs of protection, likewise keep it short. In the case of both surahs, they act as talismans to ward off evil forces. Surah 1, the opening, the Quran's most often recited verses, then appears, providing the future Muslim community with an oral recital to replace those creeds hinted at in Surah 112. Imagine, if you will, the prophet packing a sort of mental Quranic suitcase. In this mental suitcase, as it were, there is a full spectrum of prayer, creed, and protection from danger. These 5 easily memorized surahs are then concluded in the series with Surah 54, which is both a longer surah again, and likewise reverts to one of the two unusual features of Surah 55, the constant reprise. But now, rather than that surah's long meditation on the duality in creation, the reprise celebrates the Quran's own ease of memory, followed by a liturgical response like a Christian litany. Certainly we've made the Quran easy for remembrance, yet is there anyone who takes heed? So, after a string of very short, very memorizable surahs, the Quran hammers home its own memorizability, a rather useful feature of the text, if it is being purposely designed to be taken on the road. So, does this sequence of surahs represent a trip, say to Yemen or beyond, by ship? Can we say that the prophet took a voyage as a merchant, or perhaps as a preacher, to Yemen in the earliest strata of the Meccan Quran? With certainty, no, we can't. Well, it's certainly possible, given how little we know firsthand about the economics and agriculture of the 7th century Hijaz. We cannot here confirm or deny anything this way. But even guesswork has its place. We still have the observation that the early sources call Muhammad a merchant, and that there's only minimal reference in any source to what that actually looked like. Rather than trying to lock on to a particular unknown event in Muhammad's life, we can use thought experiments like this one to resolve a larger, more significant tension in Quranic studies: the context of the Quran, the lives and cultures of the Quran's primary audiences, and I do mean audiences, Instead of trying to rip the Quran out of the Hijaz whole cloth, or conversely, turning the Hijaz into a major cultural hub, there's a space for a larger cultural sphere in Muhammad's world, as other scholars before have already begun to consider. We can simultaneously entertain that Mecca was a minor settlement in a remote and rough location, but that it did have regular, perhaps commercial contact with the larger world. We don't have to collapse Mecca into the Levant or Mesopotamia, or into some other more cosmopolitan sphere, either literally or culturally. We only need to acknowledge that, like with the break in the Meccan and Medinan surahs, that the Prophet moves, and that these movements have left traces on the received Quran.